all for coming tonight. I think you have many better things that you could be doing. Nobody wore a mask to the lecture. Nobody brought a trumpet. No, you're in the wrong place. The title of this talk is How to Make a Refugee. It's a title which is appropriated from that of a short film made by the British artist Phil Collins, no relation to the rock star, in May 1999. He was filming in the refugee camps on the Macedonia-Kosovo border that were temporarily home to many of the hundreds of thousands of Kosovars deported by Serbian troops and police before and during the NATO air campaign. Collins took his camera into those camps and accompanied journalists and human rights investigators who were speaking with refugees. How to Make a Refugee is an unusual 12-minute portrayal of one such encounter. Packed into a small room with a crowd of journalists and two families from Kosovo, Collins's camera documents the visual and narrative practices by which the figure of the refugee is constructed. Reporters interview, through a translator, a 15-year-old boy who tells the story of his family's flight from Kosovo and the violent interruptions of that journey by police and border guards. He has been injured, and he takes off his shirt to reveal the stitches closing what seem to be a bullet wound in his stomach, and lifts up his leg to show that it's been broken and is in a cast. All the while, flashbulbs are popping, people are moving around, light meters are being shoved in front of his face, his baseball cap is taken off and put back on, and Collins's camera, participating in the production without fully being part of it, shows us not only his story and his injuries, but also their presentation and documentation. It's a document of the document. The second half of the film shows us the somewhat odd wrangling by one of the photographers, of the boy's family and the other family with whom they are living onto a not large enough couch for a group portrait. Once positioned, everyone smiles as their picture is taken. The news teams pack up and leave, and the film ends. I'm going to show you just a couple of minutes of the beginning of the film so that you get the mise en scène here. No? It was so nicely greeting you when you walked in. That was a good sound. Okay. Thank you.
Maybe all of? Yeah. Take a clip, please. Wait, take a clip, please. Take a clip.
No, it's better we don't, no? No, it's good for that. It flows there.
you get the idea. In about a minute, that flower pot that you see in the very foreground, the camera moves a little bit behind it, and then for the rest of the first half, the flower kind of shields his torso from view. And they interview him now. So that's all the video I'll have. So we can. The film is generally interpreted as an expose of the tropes and strategies by which the news media constructs humanitarian or disaster narratives. It exposes the mechanisms of the exposure of suffering. The mise en scène, the framing of the story, is brought into the frame and becomes the story itself. The implication seems to be that the refugee is made by the cameras and reporters, hence the title. The refugee does not so much present himself as be represented by others. One reviewer summarizes this line of interpretation, which I'll underline, is not the only line, but a prominent one, as follows, quote, "Each element comes together within the frame, and the boy, at first identifiably human, vanishes into the image. The cliché, Muslim, rural, peasant, poor, is accomplished. The subject is ready for consumption," unquote. This interpretation repeats the general theorem according to which refugees are made to be speechless emissaries, in the much-quoted words of Lisa Malki. I see something else going on here. I see a claim being made and the making visible of the apparatus that constructs and transmits that claim. The refugee, 15-year-old Bashir Haldi, speaks and tells a story, presents himself, not under conditions of his own choosing, if there ever are conditions of one's own choosing, but under the conditions that are necessary for his speech to be heard and the marks on his body to be seen. I see evidence being presented, an admission that evidence does not speak for itself, but needs transmitters, ventriloquists, translators, staging. I see a collaboration, asymmetrical to be sure, a non-ideal, but nevertheless a speech situation. In an interview, Collins later recalled his time in those camps, where he also took many video portraits of children and families outside, playing, posing, eating. And he surprises his interviewer with this claim. He says, "It seems ridiculous now, and it's difficult for me not to romanticize the situation or my role within it. But I distinctly remember that not to take a picture would have been an insult." And the interviewer says, "Not to take it?" And he says, "Every few minutes or every few steps I made, someone would say, 'Take my picture.' They wanted some marker, as if this chaos needed to be recorded. Even when I had no film left, simply to take the picture without film was a necessary transaction, which justified my presence there." There was also a specific etiquette to the manner in which relationships between them and myself were established. What is amazing to me is the way people stand still for the camera. It becomes almost like posing for a portrait, as you would do for a stills camera. He was shooting with a video camera. Okay? Not to take the picture would have been an insult. Amazing to me is the way people stand still for the camera. And the footage that he's describing there, he inserted into the middle of another film. It's not in this film. Another film, which is a very strange one, in which he asks Kosovar refugees, again, from this period, who were brought up when Kosovo was part of Serbia, and so grew up, many of them speaking both Serbian and Albanian. And he asks the Kosovars, after the war and the refugee crisis, to speak to him in Serbian. And in the middle of that series of interviews in which they're speaking to him about Kosovo, but in Serbian, he intercuts this footage that he's describing in this interview. So my question about the video and about the interview in a very telegraphic form is, why do people in refugee camps stand still for other people with cameras? Here's a second form of the question. Why is it that so often in such varied places, in so many languages, over so many years, people find themselves in situations where they need to say what would otherwise seem to be the most obvious, most superfluous, most taken for granted thing imaginable, namely that they are human beings? In 1787, this statement took an extended and interrogative form in what became the leading emblem of the British campaign to end the slave trade, the medallion produced by the workshop of Josiah Wedgwood, showing a kneeling African figure in chains, looking upward, hands clasped, and gesturing towards some undepicted other. The caption of the medallion describes or transcribes the gesture as a question: "Am I not a man and a brother?" Is this question rhetorical, which is to say, doesn't really need to be asked because its answer is self-evident? Is it simply a more persuasive way of stating the obvious? Or does the utterance pose a real question? A question that needs nothing more urgently than an answer and someone else to answer it. The question would then imply not self-evidence, but exclusion, hierarchy, supremacy, ownership, and exploitation. It would be saying, I have not been treated as a man and a brother, and I demand a change. I ask, and perhaps might do more than just ask, but the recognition can only come from you. I claim kinship, brotherhood, with you, and seek recognition as precisely that sort of thing that I have heretofore been treated as not being, a human being. So from a clearly inferior and asymmetrical position, the figure requests equality, equal treatment. More than a century later, the sanitation workers of Memphis, Tennessee, on strike from February through April 1968, and famously supported by the Reverend Martin Luther King, it was in Memphis during that strike that he was assassinated, marched in the streets wearing signs bearing the most condensed form of the claim, I am a man. Addressing the strikers, their local leader, the Reverend Herbert Lawson, had said, "For at the heart of racism is the idea that a man is not a man, that a person is not a person. You are human beings. You are men." The signs claimed this, and in the first person, which is important. The marchers demonstrated it, but precisely not as something that could be taken for granted. It only makes sense against the background of a practice, a legal and political and social system by which a man is not a man. Wedgwood's medallion was cast long ago, and we're about a half century from the Memphis strike. The Atlantic slave trade ended, slavery in the British colonies was legally abolished, Black Americans successfully campaigned for political equality, more or less. But these perplexing sentences, questions, and statements keep coming. No one in Europe probably needs to be reminded of this, but for the rest of us, let me recall what we were reading and watching in the fall of 2015, almost 3 years ago right now. Here are the first paragraphs of a Reuters news story from September 1st, 2015, datelined Budapest. Hundreds of angry migrants, which is a great formulation, angry migrant. Hundreds of angry migrants demonstrated outside Budapest's Eastern Railway terminus on Tuesday, demanding they be allowed to travel on to Germany, as the biggest ever influx of migrants into the European Union left its asylum policy in tatters. Around 1,000 people waved tickets, clapping, booing, and shouting, "Germany, Germany," outside the station. Later, they sat down, staring at a police blockade erected at the entrance. "Please, we are human too," said a sign in German held up by a young boy in a smaller group which protested into the evening. end of quotation. German news reports likewise refer to signs at the train station that read simply, "Wir sind auch Menschen." 3 days later, there were still people stuck in that train station, and the mood was a little different. The trains to Germany and the informal 200 euro taxis to the border were much less plentiful, and the Hungarian authorities were beginning to redirect asylum seekers to camps within Hungary. Another news report told their story this way, quoting Syrian refugee Bashar al-Nasrat, who said in broken English, "We don't want to go to camp. We pay our money to move on. We skip," and I think that is escape, "from our country because our army killing us and breaking us. So better we stay in Syria in our house, not to sleep on the floor." Mr. al-Nasrat said he'd been invited to Germany and is desperate to get there. We are not animals, we are human. If they are human too, we need something. We need to know what will happen to us. Unquote. That day, the refugees took matters into their own hands. What became known under the slogan and the hashtag March of Hope was a trek on foot from Budapest to the Austrian border. Bernd Kasparek, the German human rights lawyer, characterized it this way: "The images of this march will surely find their place in the iconography of this long summer of migrations. A long line of people who, after a week of waiting, reappropriated their own mobility and collectively left Budapest." It was Kasparek who coined the phrase long summer of migration. Wir sind auch Menschen. Please, and there's the address in the English translation. We are humans too. We are not animals, we are human. And we insist that this difference be recognized by those who already call themselves human. The claim needs to be made because recognition is what we want, and it can only come from others. We want to be treated differently by them, seen and heard in a new way, as something new. They treat us as, or as if we were, animals. Al-Nasrat's compressed protest cites sleeping on the floor and not having a sense of what will happen next in his life. And we want to move from that category to another. And, this is the paradox of this kind of claim, we need to claim this, but it only makes sense because we are already human, just like the others whom we address. So it's both a claim for a transformation of status and a declaration of an existing status, and it doesn't function properly if it's not both of those things. Humanity, then, is not a baseline or a ground. It's a claim and an accomplishment when it's accepted, but it's a contingent one. These most obvious statements apparently still need to be uttered, and they need to be demonstrated, put into action, performed, and materialized. Hence the march in Memphis and in Budapest, the enactment or the reappropriation of the capacity to flee and to move, the claim to space and to voice. The claim to be human and the march to the border need to be thought of together. They are claims to what ought to go without saying, but in fact needs to be said and heard, and they seek to put what is presently denied into contention, into negotiation, up for grabs. I take from these really telegraphic examples this lesson. There's a battle about who or what counts as a human being, and there are no naturally occurring or pre-given rules controlling the outcome of this battle. The outcome of the battle, in fact, sets the rules at any given time. Claiming that I am a man or that we are also humans is a manner of challenging the existing definition of membership, disputing the currently functional rules of inclusion in this category. This is not a metaphysical contest or a rhetorical exercise in the depreciating sense of the phrase, but a political one. It's a battle over access to politics or political life, a a claim to share a world with others. We can read that in the little word too. We are also humans, or we are humans too. So there are already some, and we are more, or we are like. In the comparison or the extension is a claim to equality. Although where one sleeps, on the floor or in a house, and what one can imagine about one's future might seem to be the most private of matters, Mr. Al-Nessarat makes them public and political, disputes the fact that he's presently denied that to which others have access. Claiming humanity is not to reassert ownership over something that one has lost. It is to dispute its definition, challenge its monopolization by others, put it into play. In this sense, human is what Rancière would call a political name. He says, political names are litigious names, litigious in the sense of dispute, names whose extension and comprehension are uncertain and which open, for that reason, the space of a test or verification. Political subjects build such cases of verification. Am I not a man and a brother? Aren't we human? That's the beginning of a demonstration as well as a claim and a question. It's the building of the case, the space of testing or verification, the provision of evidence to others that we need to attend to when we think about refugees and human rights. So, refugees are made. They're made by violence and catastrophe, whether by war or markets, or what Hannah Arendt calls very gently in her strange short text called We Refugees, discrimination. Arendt, who is a refugee from Nazi Germany. They're made by law and convention as well. And they're made in words and images addressed to others, sent to and conditioned by those others from whom some sort of response is demanded. Refugees depend on others. This does not mean that they are powerless, speechless, or deprived of agency, although sometimes they are. On the contrary, precisely because they depend on others, they need recognition in the eyes and ears of others. For that reason, they make claims. This means, in other words, that refugees have something to prove. The conjoined motifs of how we look to others, what we have to prove, and how we are treated structure Arendt's We Refugees. The very title is not simply an apposition or a definition or the name of a speaking subject. It stakes a claim, makes a demand on others for recognition. We Refugees means we are refugees, even if the first thing she underlines in the essay is that we don't like to be called by that name, and that our particular condition turns on its head the traditional predicates attached to that subject. Refugees, historically, she says, have been refugees because of some act committed or some political opinion held. And in this case, they're refugees because of who they are, not what they did. Nevertheless, she makes the claim to be a refugee. We have had to seek refuge, she says. We have arrived in a new country without means, and we have to be helped by refugee committees. And indeed, she was a helper in addition. Her first years in the U.S. Were spent working, resettling refugees. So she's a refugee humanitarian or a refugee helper. And during the previous stops on this journey, even when flight was more voluntary than it later became, she says, the refugees were even more sensitive about the name, while still making claims and presenting themselves to others. This is a great formulation. We did our best to prove to other people that we were just ordinary immigrants, as opposed to refugees. But it's still, the rhetorical scene is of proving to the other what you are. There are no refugees without the ritual and rhetoric of proof, or to speak more precisely, without the presentation of evidence. Success is not guaranteed, obviously, that goes without saying. We did our best, she says, to prove what we were. The pages that follow this bold introduction take an unexpected turn to the phenomenon of suicide among refugees, and it comes out of nowhere, which she interprets, finally, if hesitantly, as, quote, perhaps the last and supreme guarantee of human freedom, unquote. A claim to the exercise of agency and a demand for recognition, not now as a refugee, but as a human being, made from the outermost limit of human life, in fact, made from the grave. Even that, the freedom and agency of the human being, has to be claimed, enacted, demonstrated. So it's a text about refugees, but it doesn't hesitate to make this escalation to apparently more inclusive categories. From this extreme, Arendt retreats, but the paradigm is established. What refugees seek is to be recognized as somebodies, she says. Once we were somebodies about whom people cared. Or, sadly, that's one case, as something more basic, without any particular characteristics, simply as a dignified human being. But her emphasis throughout is on what she calls treatment. She says, there is also the deep despair of that middle-aged man who, going through countless shifts of different committees in order to be saved, finally exclaimed, "And nobody here knows who I am." Since nobody would treat him as a dignified human being, he began sending cables to great personalities and his big relations. He quickly learned that in this mad world, it is much easier to be accepted as a great man than as a human being. And she refers to this in the chapter in the Origins of Totalitarianism on human rights and the refugee. She quotes the same phrase, "Nobody here knows who I am." And there she has makes the amazing claim that the only way out of the legal limbo in which many refugees found themselves was either to commit a crime and hence be recognized by the law, out of the pale of which refugees had previously fallen, or to be a genius, criminal or genius. But what apparently ought to underlie that is out of their reach. Easier to be accepted as a great man than as a human being. The quest for recognition, the project of being treated as somebody or just a dignified human being, leads her fellow refugees, says Arendt, down all sorts of equally strange paths, which she nicknames variously putting up a front, playing roles, pretending to be something else. Very few individuals, she writes, have the strength to conserve their own integrity when their social, political, and legal status is completely confused. Lacking the courage to fight for a change of our social and legal status, we have decided instead, so many of us, to try a change of identity. And that's the polarity that then structures the essay. Changing identity, putting on a mask, or fighting for a change in our social, legal, and political status. But those are both projects of recognition. All these attempts lead back inexorably to a void or a fissure where there ought to be a ground, but there isn't. There is only the purely contingent, treatment-based, social, which is to say constructed, character of the human status. As she later emphasized in the chapter on human rights and the origins of totalitarianism, there's nothing to be taken for granted and lots to lose when you do about the sheer fact of being human. Even that fact is a constructed one, dependent on others. It's entirely possible, she writes there, that, quote, the loss of home and political status can become identical with being expelled from humanity altogether. So, anybody who was worried that there was a metaphysics of humanity or something underlying this doesn't need to have that worry. In We Refugees, this leads to the remarkable warning against imagining that being human as such is any defense against anything. It's a slightly long quotation. If we should start telling the truth that we are nothing but Jews, and that essay is largely addressed to fellow Jewish refugees, it would mean that we expose ourselves to the fate of human beings who, unprotected by any specific law or political convention, are nothing but human beings. I can hardly imagine an attitude more dangerous, since we actually live in a world in which human beings as such have ceased to exist for quite a while, since society has discovered discrimination as the great social weapon by which one may kill men without any bloodshed. Since passports or birth certificates, and sometimes even income tax receipts, are no longer formal papers, but matters of social distinction. Unquote. A world in which human beings of such have ceased to exist for quite a while, thanks to the discrimination that kills without leaving any marks. We refugees and others do not start as human beings. This is not something that goes without saying, to be taken for granted, not a fact of birth or of life. Being human in the world in which we actually, her word, live, is something granted, and hence must be claimed. Arendt shows us a rhetorical, documentary, forensic contest, a battlefield on which the weapons are passports, birth certificates, even income tax receipts, and where what's at stake is a battle for acceptance or recognition. The terrain of social distinction is also the territory of social death. She protests against this while insisting on its reality and actuality. If we refugees want to be recognized, we're going to have to get engaged in the messy business of claiming, documenting, demonstrating, offering evidence, and persuading the others on whose social standards we depend. Why do we, have to prove anything, to seek recognition at all? Isn't that a double injustice? First, the lack of recognition, then redoubled in the necessity that the very cry for recognition has to come from the unrecognized one, that the one who is not seen or heard has first to make him or herself seeable and hearable, has to seek out, beseech the other for recognition. A number of contemporary scholars who are developing what could be called a critical human rights paradigm have explored and denounced this double imposition. And we're looking at some of this in our seminar. I'm thinking in particular of Didier Fassin, Miriam Tickton, Nicola Perugini, among others. In his powerful critical account of the logic of contemporary humanitarianism, called Humanitarian Reason, Fassin indignantly calls our attention to what he argues is a new fact of life in the helping professions. Quote, "In the past, aid was given unconditionally, whereas now applicants are required to expose their suffering." And that's something like what you saw in the opening clip there. This mandate that suffering be exposed, that claims be made, first through narrative and later through the testimony of the body, and then maybe later through the testimony of forensic experts, draws Fassin's critical attention. In a rich ethnography of French domestic humanitarianism, he charts what he says are the demands for evidence, whether narrative or physical, that the authorities require of their supplicants. Another slightly long quotation. Whether they are asylum seekers or foreigners seeking residence permits, poor people visiting clinics in disadvantaged neighborhoods or attending local job seeker centers, applicants for assistance from regional bodies or from humanitarian organizations, individuals applying to over-indebtedness committees or rent arrears support committees, and that's a catalog of the topics he covers in his book. In other words, anyone for whom recognition of a right is never separated from a reminder of the debt to society they are thus contracting. Whether they are any of these supplicants, they are expected to produce the same narrative tropes and forms of argument to justify their request, and the same procedures of evaluation and judgment are used to decide if they can legitimately be granted the precious commodities of residence permits, medical or social services, financial assistance, and debt rescheduling. In return for the gift of fragments of their life, they receive the counter-gift of a means of survival. It's a very powerful narrative that he offers. And sometimes even the story is not enough. As his journey through the landscape of the French asylum and refugee bureaucracy unfolds, he discovers the spaces where testimony or a doctor's certificate concerning a testimony no longer suffices as proof of harm and hence of status. More and more often, the testimony of the body itself, its wounds or illnesses, is a more effective utterance than that of the voice or the narrative. This form of exposing suffering is physical. It's the self-presentation of a wounded or injured or diseased body, hopefully, if one can say that, sufficiently ill or injured so as to trigger the so-called humanitarian exception in French asylum law. Under these conditions, he continues, the asylum seekers' accounts, long the only evidence testifying to their story and justifying their request, were no longer sufficient to confirm the truth of the alleged persecution. The body, which could have retained a trace of it, came to be seen as potentially providing tangible proofs. So he tells the story of the kind of increasing burden of proof on the refugee or the applicant for asylum, but or for assistance. But in between, he reminds you subtly that there has always been some form of demonstration required. First, it's simply my statement without any further verification. Then a secondary expert needs to enter. And then third, a scientific expert or something like that. But the condition of the applicant-supplicant has always been one of needing to demonstrate. So I take that as an important lesson there. I'm not convinced by the story of this golden age in which rights could simply be exercised on demand. What he said, the unconditional granting of the right. He's deeply concerned by what he sees as the displacement of a vocabulary of domination, which might correspond more to the human rights vocabulary, by one of misfortune, of injustice by one of suffering, of violence by one of trauma. What ought to be unconditional now requires proof. What should be provided as a matter of right now is only offered in exchange for evidence. I think if you checked in with some human rights lawyers or advocates, they would say that this moment of the unconditional acceptance is rather mythical, but it gives him a critical position. I'm not convinced by this story. Sorry, I said that twice. I'm not convinced by the story of the golden age in which rights could simply be exercised on demand. And sometimes neither is he. In one powerful passage, he seems to take the protest back. In fact, to reverse it and to discover in the ritual of testimony and the exposure of one's suffering to another, both a basic ethics and even a politics, of recognition, of verification, of what we could call a counter-forensics, a dissident forensics. For the medical doctors to whom the physical and narrative evidence of persecution was presented, Fassin says, drawing up the certificates that attested to those claims, he says, meant recognizing that the persons concerned had indeed suffered the violence they claimed to have heard. Not only were they listened to, they knew they had been heard. While those who face the extremes of horror have a painful experience of the unspeakable, they are also often confronted with an experience of the inaudible, which is no less harrowing. No one hears their account. Today, the dominant ethos of the authorities with regard to asylum is suspicion, which is to say, discounting the claim up front. Doubt is cast on stories, facts are disputed, evidence is dismissed. Convincing the doctor may therefore be a first and sometimes decisive step in the production of one's truth. The mark is no longer on or in the body. It's present in a document that has legal value. The scriptural trace, whether it repeats the account or testifies to bodily, the first-person account, or testifies to bodily traces, envelops the fragile words and invisible wounds of the asylum seeker in its legitimacy. Thus, writing does not have merely practical virtues. It also has a symbolic and hence political value, of which the medical certificates remind us. So if you've read the chapter of the book, this passage will have stood out for you because the doctors are, up to that point, largely seen as complicit in this, in the raising of the ante, the raising of the burden of proof all along. And here they have this different role of not only listening, but evidencing the fact of having heard. And that which starts as an ethical relation with the subject becomes a political gesture, right? Symbolic, even political, he says. It's unjust that people who suffer injustice are put in the position of having to persuade other people that what happened to them was wrong, or even that anything actually happened to them. But it seems that evidence, whether evidence of a crime or more fundamentally of being human, is not self-evident. No evidence speaks for itself. The witnesses need other witnesses to read and interpret and translate and represent. To make a claim heard always requires some amplification. And of course, it opens the door to all kinds of misrepresentation, distortion, exploitation, and so on. But it's a sine qua non of the process. In closing, I want to return to the Budapest train station. The speakers whose demands I began by quoting were not just left out, had not just been accidentally or inadvertently left out of political life. It was not a simple omission, not a matter of haste or a momentary lapse that excluded them from participation or recognition. At any given moment, there is a line or lines demarcating who counts as a member of the community and who doesn't. This is easy to see when we're talking about citizenship, but the structure extends to any and all such communities, even ones that proclaim their universal extension and radical openness, like humanity, have to make decisions, conscious or not, about the minimal requirements for inclusion, whether they're seemingly trivial ones like age or species, or seemingly vicious ones like race or gender. Discrimination, to use Arendt's term, is always happening. The existing features of any political sphere, the constitution of the community at any given time, is premised on exclusion. One cannot wish or theorize this away. One can only put up with it or challenge it. And the story of politics is about the challenges and the contests over those lines of demarcation. Or to put it a bit more carefully, it's about projects to politicize subjects and topics that have not been understood as topics for public discussion or as members of a public. And in the other direction, lest you think this is always a happy story, about projects to put certain subjects and issues out of political contest, to naturalize or depoliticize them. So the borders of membership in the human community can go out, and they can also go in for the same reason. Humanity is one of these issues. We are that issue, precisely because it's not clear who we are. We are the ones deciding, which is to say debating, who we are. That's why it's so important that that essay is called We Refugees. The history of human rights is the history of arguments and battles about who humans are, about who counts as us. Many years ago, Claude Lefort put this very elegantly in an economical and profound critique of the erroneous attribution of a theory of natural rights to the American and French declarations of human rights. This claim that it's a naturalist concept masks, he says, quote, the extraordinary event constituted by a declaration that was an auto-declaration. That is, a declaration by which human beings, speaking through their representatives, right, so amplification, revealed themselves to be both subjects and objects of the utterance in which, all at once, they named the human in one another, spoke to one another, appeared before one another, and in so doing, made themselves into their own witnesses and their own judges. Okay, so this paradigm of evidence, testimony, witness is not an kind of accidental add-on to the question of the history of human rights. It's a fundamental element of the game you're playing once you're in the I'm claiming human rights game. The refugees in Budapest, speaking and marching, were repeating and enacting this declaration. Time will tell about how well they did it, about whether they managed to make themselves heard. We are humans too, far from being obvious, is both a challenge and a challenge to hear. How do those who have no standing, whom we do not recognize as one of us, who do not count and do not even appear before us as fellow political subjects, how do they make themselves heard and attended to? These are not purely rhetorical or overly dramatic questions. Think of how long it took for slaves to be registered or recognized as human beings, a struggle that has still not been definitively accomplished, or for torture to be abolished, also not exactly a done deal. And for good reason, as it were. If membership in the community is premised on the exclusion of others from it, then the identity and self-understanding of those who do count depends precisely on not being those who don't. So when the excluded say, "Count us, we are humans too, like you," they are not simply asking to make the space of the community bigger, to add some extra chairs to the table, as it were. They're asking for a new space, a new table, and a new definition of who it is who sits at it. When they are recognized, heard, admitted, the definition of who we all are undergoes a shift. It's no wonder that these matters are so strongly contested and that people have to keep contesting them. Thank you.